This is the story of a couple living in a modest area of the city. Joseph had stormed out of his house, filled with anger and sadness. His face looked dull and lifeless. Once again, he had argued with his wife, Nancy. These fights had become a daily routine. They had a love marriage. Nancy came from an affluent family, while Joseph was from a middle-class background. His parents had passed away, and he lived alone. After marriage, Nancy realized that she couldn't manage with Joseph's job income alone. She couldn't say anything to her own family, so to keep their lives going, she started working. However, she constantly reminded Joseph of her contribution and never acknowledged his efforts. Because of Nancy's attitude, Joseph grew distant from her. A long time passed, but Joseph hadn't returned home. Nancy stood by the door, waiting for him. Despite the fights, there was still love between them. Just then, a couple passed by. Their appearance reflected poverty, yet their faces showed deep love for each other. While walking, the boy bought a candy floss from a vendor and offered it to the girl. She took it eagerly and thanked him multiple times. The boy said, almost instinctively, "I can barely do anything for you, and yet you thank me for the smallest things." The girl looked at him lovingly, smiled, and began eating the candy. The two walked on, eventually disappearing from Nancy's feet, but they had left her with a lesson. Joseph returned home a little later. Nancy set the table and sat with him for dinner. Without preamble, she looked at Joseph and said, "Thank you." Joseph looked at her, surprised. "For what?" he asked. "For everything, but most of all, for enduring all my arguments and still coming back home," she replied. Joseph smiled. After that day, Nancy made a habit of saying thank you. She thanked him often for the smallest things. Her positive attitude kept Joseph happy, and he worked even harder for her. Eventually, a time came when Nancy no longer needed to work, because Joseph was earning enough to comfortably meet all of her needs. Nancy, with her newfound gratitude, also learned to be content with limited resources.